Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Red and White Authority with Art Regner and Kevin Allen. It's episode 2, and we're looking at the trade deadline. So let me bring in from USA Today Hockey Hall of Fame writer Kevin Allen. Kevin, it's always great to see you.
Yeah, we only exactly almost 3 hours, or excuse me, 3 days till the NHL trade deadline on Monday, and yesterday we had some pretty big moves, including a player that most people thought was untradeable, David Clarkson of the Toronto Maple Leafs, going to the Columbus Blue Jackets in a trade for Nathan Horton, and obviously that was about cap space and money and. Today there's lots of rumors out there, including some involving the Detroit Red Wings.
Well, let's before we get into the Wings and talk even about last night's game, and we're going to really cover it extensively today. The Clarkson trade. I was watching a lot of the with the center ice package and all that. I was watching all the Canadian broadcasts last night for the Canadian teams, and it strikes me as kind of weird. There's people that love the trade, especially in Toronto, because as you said, it looked like Clarkson was unmovable. And Nathan Horton, who may never play again, but really wants to try to come back, who I've always liked as a hockey player. But the sentiment seems to there was a lot of anger towards Dave Nonis and the Toronto Maple Leafs for circumventing the salary cap. But I mean, if it works, it works, right? I never really look at anybody who says, well, they're circumventing something. I mean, it's still they're playing by the rules.
Yeah, well, and plus it's not really cap circumvention. Like you can't just suppose that Nathan Horton is never going to play again. So the only way you can make a case that it is cap circumvention, if you know absolutely that Nathan Horton is not going to play, and even as you said, even if that were true, I mean, it's within the rules. There's nothing that says he couldn't do that. But we don't know that. I mean, it seems unlikely that he'll play again, but I'm sure in his mind he probably believes that there's a chance he could do that. If he has the surgery, the fusion of the vertebrae, I think it becomes even less likely. And maybe there's only a 10% chance. But I've covered the league long enough to know several guys whose careers that seemed like they were over. I remember Brian Berard obviously lost the sight in an eye, took the permanent disability payout, and then found another doctor who said, I can, help you a little bit. And he came back and played with limited vision in one eye. So, I mean, the people who are crying cap circumvention are saying, Nathan Horton has no chance of playing in Toronto. The only reason Toronto wants to make the deal is, and it really is not that important next season because they won't go all the way to the cap. And in a couple of seasons when they're back in contention, they'll be able to put Nathan Horton on long-term injury reserve, and they'll get some cap relief, and therefore they'll be spending more than the actual cap if they go to the cap. But I just don't see that. You can't just say that. Well, we know he's not going to play because you don't know that. So, I mean, I thought this was a good thinking outside the box move for both teams. I mean, both teams are very happy because in the Blue Jackets situation, they're not a cap team. It's about the payout for them, and his contract was not insured. Sometimes NHL teams will, on a long-term deal, get an insurance company that will guarantee that contract against injury. So if there's a player and he has a long-term injury, then they pay him the money so that the team doesn't have to do it. Now, in the Blue Jackets case so they're paying this money to Horton and they're getting nothing in return. So to getting Clarkson back, who may be overpaid for the way he's been playing, this is a real benefit for them. They now have a player at least because their salaries are very similar. So it was a good move from them, and they probably have the best upside because Clarkson may end up playing the way he did when he was in New Jersey, and then suddenly they have a 30-goal scorer playing on one of their top two lines and a guy with a little bit of bite. So they're pretty happy with this deal, and maybe Nathan Horton can come back and be the force that he was in Boston, and not likely, far less likely than Clarkson, coming from behind. So I don't see it as cap circumvention. I don't even think you can make a case for it. In fact, the league has already come out and said that it's not cap circumvention. Presumably for the reasons that I just articulated, and that is you don't know for sure where Nathan Horton is.
Well, when you look at it, another interesting thing is that they're almost again going for the Canadian broadcasters. And yesterday or last night they really did break this trade down. Was that they believe that David Clarkson is a system type of player, and that in New Jersey with the trap system, they cut off half of the ice, and that was exactly the type of game he should play because he's not really a gifted skater. He could find the open spots on the ice and be able to shoot the puck, which he can do very, very well. As in Toronto, which they kept saying over and over, it doesn't matter if it's David Clarkson or whomever, Boschevin, whomever, no one can play in that system. No one knows what Toronto's doing. So, Clarkson said, I like their system, and, the reporter that was talking about it said, of course he likes their system because Columbus has a system. Toronto has nothing going on for it. So, they kept, and really harsh on the Leafs, but they were saying, here's a team that's going to tear itself down. I know we alluded to it on the last podcast, and a couple of names that they think that are going to be certainly moved are Phil Kessel. People are talking about. They don't think that's going to happen, but Dion Phaneuf, maybe Bozak, and a guy that seems to be traded all the time or been on several teams, but keeps going from Anaheim, Toronto, or wherever. Philadelphia is. I guess Jeffrey Luke.
Joffrey Lupul, yeah.
So, what do you see from there? Because, Clarkson, for a guy who wanted to go there and was a Toronto native and, tells that very touching story about his greatest moment was his dad being able to see him in his Leaf sweater. And then it was all downhill for him. I mean, before he even played a game for Toronto, a regular season game, he was suspended for 10 games. So it just was not a good situation or fit for him. And as you said, I think that he can come back and do pretty well for the Columbus Blue Jackets.
Yeah, I mean, the situation of him going back home, I mean, that did play a big role in it. This is a guy that took the Metro to the games, was out there with the crowd, and it was hard on him. When we all know that it's Montreal and Toronto are the two most difficult cities to play for an NHL team. And I think in Toronto, the fans are really, really tough on their players. And when he wasn't playing well, he certainly heard the fans chirping at him when he was out. So it was very, very difficult. I saw the situation as being a little bit similar to, if we all remember, Marty Lapointe, who got the big contract when he went from Detroit to Boston. And I think Marty knew when he took that contract that it was going to be difficult because. Who can turn down that level of money? I think Marty got $5 million. But Marty was not really a scorer, even though he got that contract based on the fact that he had a good scoring season. And I think the same is true about Clarkson. I mean, Clarkson had one really good season, but he wasn't, the kind of scorer that you could depend on to get 30 goals every year. And just like Lapointe was not the type of scorer that you could depend on to get 25 goals every year. And I think both of them got caught in the same situation where the expectations were so high and so great that they were just impossible to fulfill. I think now that Clarkson is getting into Columbus, where if he got 20 goals, they'd be thrilled because they were getting nothing out of Portland. So they'll I think this is a great situation for Clarkson to go in. Now, getting back to the other Leafs. Here's what I think. I think Roman Polak is the most likely of the players to move now. He's got 1 year left on a contract. It's about $3 million. There's way too many teams looking for defensemen. That's a pretty good contract for defensemen. If you have a pulse now and you're a defenseman, it's $2.5 million. So it kind of goes up from there. I think there's a chance that Bozak. The center could move. He's got multiple years left, but the $4 million price tag for a number 2 center is still pretty good. And he's a good player. He's almost a 52% face-off percentage guy. He has a chance to be somewhere near 20 goals, and he's a good setup guy. I think there's a decent chance he could be moved. The most intriguing guy is Dion Phaneuf. And the reason I say that is there was a lot of chatter yesterday about Dion Phaneuf because he's a $7 million cap hit. But there are several teams in this league that said, boy, if the Maple Leafs would get him down to 5.5, and I think the Detroit, now this is pure speculation, but I think Detroit would be one of those teams. It said if you got him down to $5.5 million, if Toronto would eat some salary, suddenly he looks pretty attractive as a second pairing defenseman. If you think of Dion Phaneuf as a top pairing defenseman, I think you end up getting disappointed because he makes just enough mistakes. But if you have him in that second pairing, if you're hiding him just a little bit, and by that I mean he doesn't always face the top guys on the other team, he's a tough, physical player with a big-time shot, and I think he adds a little bit of meanness to that blue line. I think suddenly he looks pretty attractive. So even though he's a big number guy, I think there's a shot he could be dealt, because I think teams are interested, and I think they all feel like he could be the difference between having a defense that just doing the job to having one that could be a little bit special, because he has some qualities to him that are difficult to find.
When you look at Dion Phaneuf, and last night, again, watching, as I said, all the Canadian television and all their speculation, a team, when they kept bringing up Dion Phaneuf, although there was a majority of them that thought he would not be moved until the trade deadline, along with Phil Kessel. They think that both of them are going, or not the trade deadline, but I mean right around July, or at the draft, pardon me, the NHL draft, that those are probably deals. Yet, when Phaneuf was talked about, the Red Wings seem to be a very prevalent team. Will the Red Wings give up if Brendan Shanahan comes down in price and says, "Listen, we'll take $2 million off right away, and if you pay him $5 million, we'll pay him $2 million for the length of the contract." If they do that, what will Detroit, do you believe, have to part with to get Dion Phaneuf, who does bring some grit and some size to a team that I think we saw in this West Coast trip, especially against the Kings? The Red Wings aren't a weakling team, or they don't shy away from physical stuff, but in a 7-game series to be constantly beat on, and they're not the biggest guys. I mean, Drew Miller plays well, Luke Glendening plays well, but they're not big dudes,
No.
By Game 7, who knows? They need maybe more of a little bit of a grit and a physical presence, and Phaneuf could certainly give that to them.
Yeah, no, you're right on it. I think your assessment of that game against LA just reminded Detroit fans about the advantage of having that big physical team. Because there's two kinds of toughness, as we all know. I mean, there's the intimidating brand of toughness, which the Red Wings have never had, not since the days of Probert and Kosher. I'm talking about in recent history. But there's also the ability to take abuse, and the Red Wings have always had that. Guys like Zetterberg and Datsuk, where they're not going to have a pancake hit on someone on the other team. They can take whatever you throw at them. However, when they play a team like the Kings, as you pointed out, it just wears them down. And I think if they could get a guy like Phaneuf, now the question is what would that be required? I mean, this is where we're just speculating. But if you look at what the trade market has shown thus far, I mean, what you would say is if they were willing to drop the price to $5.5 million, then they're going to expect a hockey trade, trade, which would mean that, you're going to pay a top price for Phaneuf. I would say, they would start out by demanding, something like a first-round pick, Pulkkinen, Sproul, Jacob Kendall, and something like that. And the Red Wings are going to try to resist, giving up a first-round pick. They don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to give out any first-round picks.
Right, and especially, it'd be interesting because dealing with Shanny, much like dealing with Stevie down in Tampa Bay, they know the Detroit system. They know how these players are groomed, and they know who's NHL ready, which is virtually almost all of them. So I think even though that Brendan might be able to give Detroit a discount in a way and pick up some of Phaneuf's salary, he's definitely going to want a couple of players that he knows are going to be part of the foundation as this Maple Leafs team starts to rebuild itself.
Well, sure. I mean, and they're going to ask for Larkin and Mantha, but that's not going to happen. I think everybody sort of knows that. That's why they're going to have a lot of options. The Maple Leafs have said behind the scenes that they've had offers where they don't have to give up salary, which I think is probably true. But those deals would have to come in the summer. I think that's why people believe that this deal is more easily transacted around the draft when salary cap concerns are not an issue, and where you can manipulate your roster. If you give up something, you can replace it. So that's why it makes more sense. But if the Maple Leafs wanted, the quicker they can strip this franchise down to the chassis, the quicker they can rebuild the engine. So there is certainly some advantage to trying to get that done. But I would think the Maple Leafs would come in trying to get Larkin or Mantha and a first round pick, and we'll take Kindle back, and that's where they go. And I think the Red Wings would push them toward. I think they'd give up a Pulkkinen and this is just my speculation, but a Pulkkinen or a Sproul. What's interesting about Sproul is the assessment among the pro scouts that I've asked about him seems to be pretty high on him, even though the Red Wings have not shown any indication that they think he's ready. Like, we haven't seen him called up.
No, not at all.
Yeah, we've seen Marchenko and obviously Ouellette. So, to me, he seems like a logical guy that maybe they could move and not feel the pain of that. But the other options for the Red Wings are the ones that we've heard. Mihalik is out there as well. I think the word on Mihalik is they wanted too much for him, and I think if that's true, the Red Wings could be thinking, well, let's see if his price goes down. But the prices we've seen paid, there's no indication that there are going to be any bargains out there. And what's really fascinating to me is one of the teams looking for a defenseman out there that the Red Wings are competing against is their good friend Steve Yzerman in Tampa Bay. That Tampa Bay team, as everybody in Detroit knows, is a quality team. And they've had injury issues, obviously, on the blue line. Matt Carroll, they expect to get back, but they could use one more guy. And I think they really missed out on Sekera. They wanted him. And the one thing they've got to get better in Tampa Bay is their power play, because with all that talent they have up front, it should be better. And it looks like they're going to have to play the Red Wings, and the Red Wings penalty killing, although it had a run of a pretty bad stretch when Mrazek was in net, it has been decent for the season. So the Lightning are looking to get a point guy for the power play. That's why they really wanted Sekera, and they lost out in that bidding to the Los Angeles Kings. So that was a win for the Red Wings.
Kevin, I know we're jumping around a little bit, and we're going to get really heavy into the Red Wings. This is the Red and White Authority with Art Regner and Kevin Allen, Episode 2. NHL Trade Deadline is the, subtitle of the of today's program. But let's go back to Henrik Zetterberg. He gets popped in the head by Jamie Benn. Z says it's a hockey play. It happens all the time. He's been hit worse, but caught him at the right in the right spot, so to speak. He didn't return to that game. He's been out with concussion-like symptoms, although I guess officially the Red Wings haven't said anything about it. Mike Babcock said he expects him to play Wednesday. If the Red Wings had a true enforcer, somebody a little tougher, and I'm not even sure Dion Phaneuf would even fit that bill, but somebody that might put the old expression, the fear of God in him. Does Ben take a liberty with Z in the face-off, sir?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's been the argument for 2 decades in Detroit. They've gotten along without him for a long time, and it seems to me that most teams are sort of moving away from that. I would say this, and I don't think the Red Wing management would dispute this. I think you can make a case that the Red Wings do have to probably mix in some, now that they're in the Eastern Conference, have to make an effort to add a little more toughness, mix it in with their skill. The Red Wings have long been a team that have just put all the emphasis on puck possession, and they've sort of, I don't know, inadvertently is maybe not the right word, but they've had toughness that just came with the skill. Brendan Shanahan was a tough player. They didn't get him because he was a tough player. They got him because he was a quality goal scorer, and they liked other qualities about him as well. So they've had it in the past, but I think they probably, you can make a case. Bringing in a fighter is not going to help them, but I think if you could, when you embrace your drafting style, if you could get a couple of the Don Cherry CHL boys who play a little bit on the edge of the rule books, it would probably make the Red Wings a more balanced team.
Kevin, have you heard that there is a discussion within the organization, and I don't want to turn this into a European, North American kind of debate, But that, and you know, essentially, maybe this is what you're saying is that the Red Wings do need to get a little bit tougher and maybe embrace more of a North American player than a European player. And you know, and I think Teemu Pulkkinen is a perfect example. Here's a guy that, you know, Ken Holland has told me we're going to have to play him right now and see if he's going to either make our team or we're going to have to trade him, because we know next year he's out of options. He's not going to clear waivers. So even though Pulkkinen seems to like to shoot the puck, and I know last night on the telecast, you know, Ken Daniels even kind of caught himself and said, "Look, yeah, he isn't Brett Hall, but he, you know, he likes to shoot the puck like Brett Hall." You know, which I understand that, you know, maybe they're going to have to give up some of this skill, some of these young players, even though I know, you know, Jan Kroc was definitely, and David Legwan was not a good deal, but you know, they're going to have to give up some of these youngsters and bring in a player that isn't going to give us a wow factor, but will be able to provide this team with a little more grit.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I think there's some logic to the Phaneuf deal, and why I said, well, you know, would they be willing to give up a Pulkkinen for him? Because, you know, not only you know, it's not a rental player. I mean, I don't think anybody looks back at last year's deal for Legwan and said, you know, that was a good idea. You know, now in hindsight, like you knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to do what everybody else was doing, where you would just bring in a guy. You know, the L.A. Kings added rental Marion Gaborik and they won the Stanley Cup. The Red Wings added Legwan and, you know, they lost those assets, including Yarncroc, who, you know, will be an NHL player. So I think that's why it makes sense if you're going to give up some of your prospects. It makes more sense, in my opinion, to do it for a guy that has some long-term staying power with the organization, a guy that has some, you know, contract left, like a Dion Phaneuf, which, you know, would change the look of the defense. I mean, it toughens up the defense to have a Phaneuf there, and he's not going to go out of his way to, you know, start brawls, but, you know, I think he would look after the players, and, you know, he makes that team a little grittier, a little tougher, and, you know, as I said, I don't think the Red Wings are looking to change the way they play hockey. They've played hockey the same way for a long period of time now, and they will continue to do so. But I'm absolutely sure that within the organization, because Ken Holland has said publicly when they moved to the Eastern Conference, we have to look at, you know, what we need to do in terms of changing or adjusting, probably is a better word, our style of play. And I think you know, there's some tough, gritty teams in the Eastern Conference, and they'd be better off if they had some guys. Now, you know, Riley Sheehan is a perfect example of a guy that, you know, he's got some size and some grit to him, and, you know, he's a good fit. And I think, you know, they'll be looking for guys like Riley Sheehan that have both skill and grit and toughness.
You know, I think Dion Phaneuf obviously is intriguing, but then again, based on, you know, things coming emanating out of Toronto, they keep bringing up guys taking slap shots at him or an empty net, and he's trying to guard the net, and these guys are just teeing up on him and then kind of talking in his face, and they're saying, listen, he doesn't go after these guys after being showed up on the ice. He's got the C on his sweater, and none of his teammates come to his defense. So, you know, almost saying that, you know, there's something about him. Let's face it, when he was in Calgary, Kevin, we heard all the stories. He was, you know, the second coming of, you know, Bobby Orr or something. I mean, as far as the next big Canadian hit guy as far as defensemen go, and it hasn't quite worked out that way. And I'm not saying he's a bad player, because he's a pretty good player. You know, he marries Elijah Cuthbert, and, you know, the actress, and you know, he's got all this kind of stuff going on, and yet on the ice, when something happens where he is disrespected, he doesn't do anything about it. Nor do his teammates, and he's the captain of the team. Is that a red flag in any way?
Well, to me, it's all about expectations. You know, I don't see Dion Phaneuf as the ideal leader of a hockey team. You know, I don't think he's really all that comfortable in that role. Right. And I think if he would come to Detroit, you know, the leadership hierarchy is pretty well established in Detroit. Like, you know, you're not bringing him in to add a layer of leadership. Now, because he's a better player, you know, he'll do some of that, but he's not coming in here and, you know, changing the way they do things. So I think if he got in Detroit, this would be the perfect situation for him. Detroit is a great place to come to because the pressure is off you. We all know who runs this team. It's Z, it's Datsuk, it's Cronwall. You don't come in here and tell anybody, well, we're going to make changes. And yet it's a great hockey town. The people are excited about the team. You don't have the same media pressure that you have in Toronto, where it's relentless. There's so many people covering the team that it would be like I think he would be absolutely relieved and thrilled to be in Detroit, which is a hockey environment without the difficulty that comes with being in Toronto. I think you would also his career would be re-energized. I think he would do things that he hasn't done in a while, playing a more pronounced physical role because he would want to prove himself here. And I think the coaching here, Babcock can be a difficult coach, but he seems to always get the best out of his players. I think he would get more out of Phaneuf than the Toronto Maple Leafs did. So I don't know how likely it is that they're going to be able to make this deal because there are a lot of teams that are in on it, I was told, and the Maple Leafs aren't convinced that trading him now is the best thing. They want to get the most for him. But me personally, the idea of thinking of him, going down in that second pairing, that's that would be a pretty good fit, and it adds something that the Red Wings don't really have, which is just that real gritty, mean guy. Phaneuf can play that role. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
No, I agree with you there. The more I hear it, or I let it kind of germinate within my mind, the more I like this deal. I would like to see Dion Phaneuf as a Detroit Red Wing. I think that and for everything, how many times have we seen it where fellas, and they're all different kind of players. Larry Murphy was a great player. Chris Chelios was a great player, but they were different players. There seem to be all kinds of fellas that find their way to Detroit and revive their career because, just as you said, the way the system is and the way the hierarchy is and the pecking order and the way the Red Wings have a style and that's the way they play, he doesn't have to come in here and, let's put it this way, he doesn't have to walk across the Detroit River from Windsor to Joe Louis. That's not why he's here. And I think you're right. He just needs a change of scenery. And quite frankly, I think virtually everybody who's playing in Toronto needs some sort of change of scenery because this is it's kind of a toxic environment there. And I'm surprised that these fellas, and I know they're professional and they're paid well, can play in an environment where no matter what they do, just doesn't seem to be good enough. Not that they're great. I heard, I think it was P.J. Stock said he believes the Leafs don't have a number one center, a number one defenseman, or a number one goalie, and that's what you need to build a team. And I'm thinking, God, if those guys are constantly hearing stuff like that, whether it's true or not, how do you get any type of incentive to go out there and play when it seems like the entire city or the media is constantly just ragging on you?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, it's a difficult environment where you're scrutinized beyond any level that you see anywhere other than in Montreal. And I just think like earlier in the season when they had the situation where the leadership group of the Maple Leafs decided not to salute the fans, after the game, which had become the Leafs tradition. Like there was nothing wrong with them making that decision, but it shouldn't have been handled like that. And all I could think of when I watched that is that would never happen in Detroit with Zetterberg as captain. That would never happen in Pittsburgh with Crosby as captain. That would never happen in Chicago with Taves as captain. These are guys that feel and know how to be a captain, and I don't think Phaneuf just fits that role. That's not an indictment of his character. That's just not everybody is born to be a leader of a hockey team. It doesn't come natural to them, and in Phaneuf's case, I don't think it does. And so I think coming here to Detroit to be in a different or wherever he ends up, I don't think he's going to be a top pairing defenseman in his next stop. Let's put it that way. He'll be a second pairing defenseman, and I think he'll be more effective player, and because of that, I think he's going to be happier, and things are going to go better for him.
Well, I have to tell you, when you grow up in Detroit, like Kevin and I have with Hockey Night in Canada, you almost know the Leafs almost as well as you know the Reds.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
You kind of grew up watching them as well. I mean, especially from the era Kevin and I are from, because hockey wasn't on all the time. There was no center ice or anything. But I guess enough Leafs talk. Let's talk a little bit about the Atlantic Division where the Red Wings are at. Florida's still trying to make a run. They they get Jaromir Jagr, and for a guy what's 42, 43 years old, first ballot Hall of Famer. And I know the Red Wings have been interested for a long time in trying to somehow get Jagr in the red and white, but they give up a second and third round draft pick. Too high, or do you think Florida's in a situation that they got to do something to make the playoffs? They bring in a named player, they got to fill up that building or try to fill up that building.
I love this move from the Panthers' perspective, and a second and third round pick, that's a heavy price. This is a rental player, but just as you said, the Panthers are last in attendance. They no longer give out free tickets in Florida, and that was a problem because they had given away so many free tickets that became the expectation. So they've drawn the line. If you want to go to a hockey game, you got to pay now. And that's that takes some time to readjust for fans because they had been accustomed to ended up with free tickets, and they've only made the playoffs once in 13 years, so they're trying to win it. They're trying to get in the playoffs for the second time in 14 years, and the Bruins have opened the door for them. The Bruins have not played well. I think everybody in the hockey world believes the Bruins are a better team than the Florida Panthers, but they haven't shown it. So because of that, I think this was a great move. They had to have some more offense. Gerard Gallant, Steve Yzerman's good friend. It's funny how all the Red Wings are all in the Atlantic Division. Coming back to haunt the Red Wings. But Gallant has done a tremendous job of improving that team's defensive play. They're far more competitive under Gallant, and Luongo has been terrific in net. They just can't score. And they've got a lot of good young players. The other night at center ice, they had Bukestad, Barkov, forgetting somebody else. They had another center. So it was Trocheck. So they had a 22-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 19-year-old, and Perry, who is 23. Those are their four centers. And, they're trying to win like that. And I like the Panthers team, and I think Dale Talon does a terrific job. But they needed more help. Talon told me on the record, I'm not giving up any of my young kids. I want to hang on to my first-round pick. He certainly did that. They believe they're going to be able to trade a guy like Fleischman or Kopechki, another ex-Red Wing. And they feel they'll be able to trade him and get a couple more draft picks back. So they feel real good about this trade, and they should. I mean, I think this sends a nice message to fans. I don't know whether they have enough. The Bruins, as I said, are a better team, and you know what? The Flyers are lurking out there, and even the Ottawa Senators have picked it up a little bit. So, we could still end up with a race in the Eastern Conference, but I like that deal from the Panthers' perspective.
Let's look at a couple of other teams. As you said, Boston should be better. They're kind of a mystery team right now. I know that they've had some injuries. Certainly Stevie wants to add a defenseman. Montreal seems to have their system down as long as Carey Price remains to be Carey Price. They don't score a lot of goals, but former Michigan Wolverine Max Pacioretty seems to pop a few in when they need it the most. How do you see the Red Wings competitors in the Atlantic trying to fill it out? Will there be some deals, especially with Boston, who a couple of weeks ago, they were hot on the trail or the pursuit of Jordan Eberle or from Edmonton or somebody like that, and is Edmonton going to be Toronto West and just try to again, and who knows what they're doing, blow that team up a little bit as well?
Yeah, well, I think the Bruins have given indication. I think that Krejci is going on the long-term IR, which means he'll be gone at least in 10 games, 24 days. And that opens up some cap room for them. I think they have over $6 million now. And I would expect I'm positive they're on, in on the Anton Vermette sweepstakes. You know it's trade deadline day when you start talking about Anton Vermette as if he's Sidney Crosby. Like, the Blackhawks are interested in him, the Bruins are interested in him, the Canadians are interested in him, and he's a good hockey player. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he's sort of the Western version of Patrice Bergeron. He's very good defensively. He can chip in offensively. He's a 57% face-off guy, and the Montreal Canadiens, has there been a more consistent team than the Canadiens? It's really been impressive. Like, the Red Wings get on a roll, and you think, well, they're going to make some ground. The Canadiens never lose. Over a 10-game span, Carey Price gave up 11 goals. 11 goals in 10 games. That's just remarkable. They've been among the league's best defensive teams all season. They're in the bottom third in goal scoring, in goals per game. I think 25th or 26th. I think Marc Bergevin, the GM there, has to get both a forward, and he's got some depth concerns on defense, and I think he'd like to add a defenseman as well. But I think they're poking around at Vermette as well. He would obviously be a really good fit. Boston. Vermette has history with Kelly there. They played on the same line together in Ottawa. I think he trains with Bergeron. So they could end up as well. So Boston, I think will improve themselves some way. They'd actually like to add a defenseman too. They're just not the same team without Johnny Boychuk. When they traded him just before the start of the season, that seemed to. It's almost like they lost their soul. I mean, Boychuk was difficult to play against. He was, a Bruins Bruin. That's the way they like to play. And then when he was out of there, like, you cross the blue line, you're just not as fearful as you once were. So they're not as strong as they have been in the past, but they're still a force. And I think Steve Yzerman has done such an incredible job of refashioning that team. I think he'll find somebody. There's not much left, but somehow Steve Yzerman will find a way. Like, he's really done an incredible job of putting together a highly competitive team in Tampa Bay.
There's no doubt. I mean, I certainly agree with you. Stevie, and Stevie's the first to tell you that it took him a while to think from the front office and not be a player. And because I can remember there were a couple of times as a player, some of the deals that he wanted or proposed, let's just say Steve Yzerman, the general manager, would never have made those deals. So he's come a long way, and as I said, he'd be the first to tell you that.
Well, what's really fascinating to me about Steve Yzerman, when he was done being a player, I mean, he is such a legendary figure. Like, there could have easily been a sense of entitlement to walk in and be one of the movers and shakers in management. We've seen that in the past. We've seen Bobby Clark, who was very Yzerman-like when he was with the Flyers. He was viewed the same way. But Steve wasn't like that. I mean, he is such a smart guy. Like, he knew that he needed to serve almost like an apprenticeship, working under Ken Holland, who is, we all know, is one of the more respected GMs in the game. And he studied it, A to Z. He went out, he scouted, he was part of the the salary cap meetings. He spent time with Ryan Martin trying to learn the ins and outs of that. Like, he worked at this just like he worked at being a player. And so nothing was handed to Steve Yzerman. And I think, to me, that's the what he should be most commended about, was the fact that he approached this as if he was starting a new career and he needed to learn. He didn't expect, okay, just because I was a great player, and he was a great player, that I know everything. He was willing to work at it, and I think he deserves all the accolades he's gotten, and the job he did for Team Canada simply adds to his his resume.
Right. It'll be interesting to see how Brendan adapts. I mean, if you look at it, you have Marty Lapointe, you have Marc Bergevin, although he really wasn't a long-time Red Wing, Bergevin in Montreal, and then Sergei in Moscow, whom I kind of get the inkling that he would eventually like to work his way back to North America and become some sort of administrator with an NHL club. But we'll have to say that for another time, Kevin. Let's go to the Red Wings specifically here and talk about some of the rumors. We've already talked about Dion Phaneuf, but let's go back to last night's game, which against the San Jose Sharks. And first of all, I've got to be honest. Because of the DirecTV thing that I have, I watched the Sharks post-game show and what they said about Detroit, and because the game is actually blacked out, so I watched the Detroit telecast, but they were talking about the Red Wings, and they said, as we've been telling you, Shark fans, during the game, the Red Wings can put it in a second and third gear, and that's exactly what they did from the second period on. They were different, and then in the third, they even kicked it up a notch. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, that used to be the case at one time, but I think the Red Wings, even though they start off slowly too much, I mean, you start on time, but this is a team that once they get their legs, they're just pretty relentless. I don't know if they're turning it up a gear. It's just that they don't let up, if that makes any sense. And I thought last night's game, all the chances they had, I thought Niemi was going to, steal a game much like Quick did the other night, but Datsuk finds a way, and then Luke Glendening's goal with 1:15 left, pretty impressive win. And really, if you look at it, as much as it was impressive, does that give, I don't know, Red Wing management and Red Wing fans like, well, we don't have to do anything at the trade deadline because this team always finds a way. And I'm not so sure. I don't know if the Red Wings are looking at that, but I'm hearing a lot of fans in Detroit say, why make any kind of move at all? Maybe get a right-handed shooting defenseman. That's all we hear about. But look at the way this team plays. I mean, they lose to LA 1-0, a team that's the hottest team in the league. And they play great, but they just find a way. Dallas, a remarkable comeback. So I know this is all kind of jumbled up, Kevin. What I'm trying, my point I'm trying to make is that you see them based on the way they played, the way they have come back, the dramatic comeback against San Jose, that this team might not do nothing at the trade deadline.
Well, I think that's entirely possible. Because I think here are their objectives. I think they would like to improve their defense if that's possible, but they won't do it at the expense of mortgaging their future, which is, I think, I don't want to call it a change because they've always kind of guarded their draft picks, but in the past I think they were more willing to do that. I think they've crossed over now to saying, hey, if you're going to survive in a salary cap era, you got to keep your first and second round picks because you know what? We draft well in Detroit, and those guys are feeding our system. I mean, having the players that move up, O'Reilly, Sheehan, and everything. Well, that's because they had they took him as a high pick and as a first round pick, and he's there and he's helping them. So I think that they were prepared. They're prepared for the idea that they may not do anything, and I think this team, the way they see it is, if they had better starts, like they would be right there with Montreal. I mean, don't you agree with that? I mean, because once they get going, they can play with any team in this league.
Right, I agree with you. I mean, start on time, as Mike Babcock likes to say, and somehow win a shootout or two. Let's get into that very briefly because I want to ask you about maybe a big move. But Jimmy Howard is a tough goalie. We both know him. I think that he has really resolve. I think he's mentally tough. He certainly wants to bring a Stanley Cup to Detroit. He loves being a Red Wing. His body language just looks completely different once a shootout starts. I don't know what it is. I know he was really happy. I thought the other night when they won the shootout that he might turn it around. It was his first one of the year. He's 1-7 now. And I know it. Look, I understand that it doesn't have any bearing come playoff time. I realize that. But if he could just somehow, I guess I'm speechless. I'm tongue-tied trying to figure out what's going on with especially Jimmy in shootouts, even though I know that the shooters really don't help him out that much either.
Well, but it's all kind of tied together. And this is what I would say about that. Like, it reminds me of what the Devils went through last year when they couldn't win a shootout, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. They struggled. The slump became so talked about that they started to second guess themselves, and they tried different things. They got out of their rhythm that they normally would do, and then they just couldn't do it. And I'm seeing that with the Red Wings this season. The shooters feel pressure because they know Jimmy's hasn't been good in the shootout. Now he's been better, but it feels like the yips. I've talked to you about this before, where we've seen it with the second baseman Knobloch not being able to throw the ball to first base. A golfer, a PGA performer, starting to miss 1 foot, 18-inch putts. The guy that has trouble at the free throw line, even though he's been a good shooter his career. I looked up, and obviously Jimmy Howard historically has been an average to slightly above average shootout guy in his career, but this season he's obviously has a mental block about it. It's obviously made a difference. You look at the number of losses that the Red Wings have in regulation, and then you say, okay, if Jimmy had won half of those games in the shootout, they'd be up there with the top, teams in the league. So it has had an impact. You just got to hope that he works his way out of it. In my mind, if he could win 2 or 3 in a row, he'd be back fine again. He's different, obviously, on breakaways than he is on shootouts. We've seen it. He's made some big stops on breakaways, this season, but shootout is different, for him. But I do think it's impacted the shooters, because I think everybody knows the troubles the Red Wings are having. They're squeezing the stick a little too tightly. I think they've gotten better in the last few games. I've noticed that Howard looks stronger. He looks a little different to me, and he did have the win. He's just going to have to work out of it.
Right. And I think Nyquist is turning out to be the best shooter on shootouts, at least recently, for the Red Wings. Kevin, Red Wings like this team. We've talked about it before, whether we've been on the radio together or during the Red and White Authority, our podcast here, that the Red Wings like this team. Mike Babcock likes this team. They seem to be poised, if they tinker around a little bit, to maybe make a legitimate run for the Eastern Conference title and also the Stanley Cup. Do you see, if they, depending on how truly inside that room when they're all together, Ken Holland and his staff, you think come Monday before 3 o'clock, the trade deadline, that they could do a blockbuster, that they could surprise us, that they could move somebody? And do you think that if they were to do something like that, I want you to speculate who you think would be involved and who they would send out and who would come back and return, or do you think that where this team is right now, the way they played, that could really upset team chemistry? And that, much like, and I'll use a Detroit analogy here, when Rip Hamilton was traded by the Pistons, you would have thought, and he just retired yesterday after, 14 seasons Rip did, that, that he perished. The Pistons were never the same after that. Could a blockbuster, something that the Red Wings management may feel could put them over the top and really compete for the Cup because they're that close, could they do a blockbuster trade guys that we haven't even discussed? Or do you think that they're going to be a little more conservative and see what this team can do?
Well, I think the one thing the Red Wings have going is this group of younger players, and we're talking Nyquist, Tatar, Sheehan, and DeKeyser, even though he wasn't part of the Grand Rapids crew. Brendan Smith was part of that. They won, some of those guys, not DeKeyser, won an AHL championship together, and they like the chemistry on this team. Those younger Red Wings don't hope for success. They believe they're going to have it, and I think they're going to be reluctant to try to disrupt this chemistry because this group that's together now believes they can come back from anything. So I don't think there's a real major chance that they're going to make an off the wall, outside the box major trade. The only way I could see that happening is, and you and I have talked about this in the past, there's been rumors all season that some pretty interesting players might be available, like an Everly in Edmonton, for example. When there was rumors that he was available, I heard the Pittsburgh Penguins or the Red Wings would really be interested if Everly was available. So, if suddenly he was available, would they be tempted? Maybe. But I don't think they would even do that now, unless it was the kind of deal where they didn't have to subtract players off the roster, and by that, they could give up, prospects in order to get that done. So, I would say it's far more likely that they would just make the traditional Red Wings move, which is, like they've done years ago. And you mentioned Murphy or McCowan, or Maranoff, where you just add a player to the mix, which always seems to be better on the chemistry than when you make a blockbuster deal where guys are moving off and then they're adjusting to the loss of their friends and with a new guy coming in.
Well, I find what's really interesting when I look at this Red Wing team is that what they may or may not do is probably predicated on the guys when they get in the room, and because there does seem to be teams in the Red Wing room where I think that some guys are almost willing to say, let's make a deal, let's really go for it and be aggressive, and the other guy will say, let's give this group a chance to show what they can do. And I think winning that Calder Cup, as you said, Kevin, really has empowered these young Red Wings where they do have confidence and they believe themselves. Because most hockey people you talk to will say there's a lot of great hockey leagues in the world. Obviously, the NHL is the best, but the AHL is the second best league in the world. Don't kid yourself. You talk about all the other leagues you want, but if you win a Calder Cup, that is actually quite a feather to put in your cap too. So when we look at the Red Wings, as I said, depending on, and I find it fascinating. I think the meetings are going to be great. When they play Nashville tomorrow, and then Sunday when they start gearing up, and Monday morning about what's out there and all the rumors. Because Ken Holland's always on top of that. Well, to see what they're going to do, I'm really eager to see how Monday turns out. But another Oiler that we haven't talked about, who has obviously local ties, played at Michigan State, is from the state of Michigan. His dad was a fine pitcher for the Detroit Tigers. His dad, obviously, Dan Petrie, is Jeff Petrie. It seems that Petrie is, I get mixed signals coming out of Edmonton that he's playing well enough now where they're thinking maybe we should sign this guy, or the price, because of the way he's playing lately, it's just going up and up and up, and that maybe the Red Wings will find that price tag a little too rich for their deal.
Yeah, Jeff Petrie has really, his value has risen for a couple of reasons. First of all, he's played well. He's been much better and lately than he was early in the season. And secondly, he's the best available rental defenseman left. The Anaheim Ducks are interested in him. I got to believe the Red Wings, depending on what the price is, would be interested in him as well. The last I heard, and I have pretty recent information, is they weren't close on a new deal. I don't understand. He's still a young man. The Oilers, why can't they get this guy signed? To be honest with you, I don't know why the Coyotes, who say they are resetting, not rebuilding, and there's a distinction there. I don't know why they're not trying to re-sign Antoine Vermette as well. I'd be working to the last minute to try to get that guy re-signed. But I think Petrie will be traded. There's a long list of teams that are interested in him. Anaheim. Chicago, with Kane gone, now has plenty of room as well. They would like to add both a forward and a defenseman. Boston would also like to have both a forward and a defenseman. We've mentioned Tampa Bay. There's a lot of teams looking for a defenseman, and I think he's always listed with the Red Wings because of his dad being Dan Petrie, and he obviously grew up in Michigan. As well, and I think he is a guy that the Red Wings will look at because he fits into that mold that we've talked about, which is the history of the Red Wings, looking just to add a guy who could just sort of slot in and then move everybody down. I mean, let's face it, you bring in a Petrie, the guy you're moving down is either Kindle or Marchenko, depending on the way you look at it, and that wouldn't be disruptive to the chemistry. So I could still see the Red Wings looking at a move like that, or Mikhailuk in Arizona.
Kevin, I'm going to ask you to put your soothsayer kind of glasses on here. 3 o'clock Monday, 3 p.m. I know trades come in at the end though, but let's just say, will the Red Wings make a deal, and what player or players will they acquire?
Well, I think they will make a deal. I think they're going to add a defenseman because historically that's what Ken Allen has done, and I think it'll be either if I had to, if you put a gun to my head, I think it would be a guy like Mikhailuk. But I think there's another guy that Roman Pollock, whose name I've never heard listed with the Red Wings, but at $3 million for a contract for next season, that's a pretty reasonable contract, and he's a pretty gritty guy. Got a little bit of tackiness to his game, and I kind of like that idea of adding a little tougher, dependable guy, and I think that's why I think he's a possibility as well.
Kevin, let's look at a broad view then of the trade deadline. What do you think the biggest surprise could be, or something to watch out for that we just don't see coming?
Oh, that's a really fine question. Well, I don't know if it would be a real major surprise, but I think some of these it's possible, and we mentioned Dion Phaneuf, but Tyler Bozak of the Maple Leafs has 4 years left on a contract. I think he could move. I think that's a reasonable price for a number two center, a guy that can approach 20 goals and be a pretty good setup man. I think a guy like him could move to a team that would like to help itself long term. And don't be surprised if Brian Burke figures out a way to make a splash on trade deadline. He's working very closely with Brad Treliving, who's his general manager, and they're looking for a long term fit. So could he call his old buddy Dave Nonis in Toronto and say, let's figure out a way to bring Phil Kessel to Calgary or Dion Phaneuf back? It wouldn't shock me. It really wouldn't shock me.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Like I said, it's great. I mean, a lot of movement. Are you surprised that there has been what I consider, a fair amount of movement even before the deadline?
Yeah, no. I think there's been a couple of things here. I think the shortage of defensemen out there in the rental market has prompted people to move quickly. I think Dean Lombardi in the Los Angeles team was playing well. He needed somebody to replace Slava Voinov, who's been suspended all season. He knew Steve Yzerman likes Sekera in Carolina, so he moved early. But I also think there's been a lot of chatter in the marketplace. These bottom teams, like these trades, are as important to them as to the contenders because they're rebuilding. Like Carolina, they're counting on these draft picks that they're getting for Sekera and for Toulouse. So they were worried that what if the guys got hurt? We get nothing for them. So I think that prompted some early movement as well. And there's some David Poyle and Jim Rutherford have histories of getting their guys early because they want to blend them in with their teams and have a better fit by playoff time. So that's played a role as well with Rutherford now being in Pittsburgh. So there's been a lot of factors that's contributed to a lot of these early deals.
Dan Bowman's a pretty innovative GM in Chicago. Obviously he learned from one of the best in Scotty about how to do things. Although most people look at Chicago this offseason and think that the cap is finally going to come back and haunt them. But with Patrick Kane going out, do they make a desperate move? Do they have to make a move? Obviously, they're going to have to do something.
Yeah, they will. I mean, I kind of have a sneaky suspicion that Teravainen, the Finnish prospect who they brought up when Kane went down, he's a really skilled young hockey player, and he's probably not quite ready for prime time, but he could be a real wild card. Like he could step in and just get hot, in the playoffs and really kind of help compensate for the loss of Kane. I mean, he has that ability. He's a game-breaking player. But saying all that, I think Stan Bowman is going to go big tomorrow. I think sometime before Monday he's going to land a forward and maybe a defenseman. Duya's been hurt. They've been an inconsistent team. I like that team a lot still, but they've been inconsistent. They have not played the way they need to play in order to be successful. And I think he's going to give them every opportunity because, Aduya probably will be gone because of cap concerns. Roosevelt will be gone. There's been a lot of talk about they might have to trade one of their forwards, a guy like Patrick Sharp. So, this is sort of a last chance maybe for this group. So he'll be out there. He's like his dad in that regard. He's not going to miss an opportunity to go for it.
One final question, Kevin, and it's about the Red Wings. At times the Red Wings have said, well, we don't have to make a move at the deadline because we're going to get injured players back. And I guess the injured player I'm asking about, and I don't really know, fans are coming up to me because I'm not even sure what his status is. How about Johan Franzen? I mean, the mule, and I mean, his scoring streaks are now fewer and farther between than they have been, but the Red Wings seem to be doing fine without him. But he's kind of the forgotten man, the lost man in this whole mix.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how the Red Wings are kind of viewing him. That if he comes back, great. But if he doesn't, it's one of those injuries where you can't predict what's going to happen, and the concussions are difficult to project, and he has been in and out as a scorer for such a long time that they've sort of gotten used to that. So having him out now, they've just learned to live without him, and I don't even think they factor him in now in terms of what do they expect to be. They don't say, well, if we hope we get him back. I think they're just counting on him not being back, and if he does come back, it's a bonus.
Kevin, I know I said last question. We're kind of running out of time here. Kevin and I were worried about could we talk for an hour, and I think we've gone over that. But, very, very quickly, the Red Wings. I know Mike Babcock says Z's coming back Wednesday, but they've been kind of hush-hush. If they do something at the trade deadline that's kind of surprising, is that because they might be a little more worried about Z, as we're talking about concussions here, than they're letting on?
Yeah, I maybe, but I don't have the sense that they're overly worried about it. Maybe I'm misreading the tea leaves, but I do think. I mean, I think all teams are hush hush about injuries now in the NHL, but I sense that they really do believe. You can usually take your cues by listening to, as you know, from the TV guys. And I felt that they seemed to imply that. There was plans for Zetterberg to be back in the lineup shortly, so I don't think they would say that if they didn't believe that to be true.
Right, he's back on the ice. He was back on the ice yesterday with his teammates. All right, Kevin, that will do it for episode 2 of the Red and White Authority. We'll be back on Tuesday after the trade deadline. Trade deadline will be our next podcast. We'll see. It's one of the best times of the year if you're an NHL fan with the trade deadline, and I'm kind of glad that they moved it up a little bit so that these new players can get acclimated a little bit more to their team. Kevin, always a pleasure. We will talk to you Tuesday.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. A trade deadline is always like Christmas.
It always is, and we love Christmas. If I still have my Christmas lights up, so I'll put them in the background. Kevin, take care. Have a good one. I know you're going to be busy. Until we meet again, everyone, have a safe and pleasant one. For the Red and White Authority and for Kevin Allen, I'm Art Regner. We'll see you. Bye-bye.